This is a waste of my time. Get on with it. You think you can judge me? I did what was necessary.
Alan Johnson, for the murder of your 4 children, you are sentenced to 295 years.
The Johnson family home sat quietly on Saguaro Lane in the suburbs of Phoenix, Arizona, a seemingly ordinary residence in a well-kept neighborhood where children's bicycles typically dotted front lawns and the sounds of play filled the air on weekends. But on September 19, 2023, the piercing wail of police sirens shattered that tranquility as officers responded to a welfare check called in by Catherine Smith, the ex-wife of former Army General Alan Johnson, who had received a disturbing letter that filled her with dread. What officers discovered inside the immaculate 2-story home would haunt them for the rest of their careers: the bodies of 4 children, Otto, Jack, Liam, and Kai Johnson, all approximately 10 years old, meticulously arranged in their beds as if sleeping, but cold to the touch and bearing the unmistakable signs of asphyxiation. Their father, 46-year-old Alan Johnson, was nowhere to be found, his military precision evident not just in the spotless home, but in the calculated manner in which he had taken his children's lives before disappearing. The investigation would quickly reveal that this was no impulsive act, but rather a coldly calculated crime committed by a man described by colleagues as charismatic but controlling, traits that had served him well during his distinguished military career, but masked darker tendencies at home. Alan Johnson had risen to the rank of general in the Army before his retirement 2 years prior, earning commendations for his tactical brilliance and leadership abilities while serving multiple tours in conflict zones around the world. His personal life, however, had been far less successful. His ex-wife, Catherine, had left when the children were very young, citing his controlling behavior and emotional abuse, though she had been unsuccessful in gaining custody of the children due to Alan's sterling reputation and powerful connections. The certified letter Catherine received on September 19th, postmarked September 17th, contained the ominous words, "You'll never get them back," a message that prompted her immediate call to Phoenix police and would later become crucial evidence of premeditation in the case against Alan Johnson. If you're watching this video, please like the video, subscribe to our channel, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Now let's continue with this devastating case. Detective Noah Martinez, a 15-year veteran of the Phoenix Police Department's Homicide Division, arrived at the scene within hours of the body's discovery and immediately recognized the significance of the crime. The children had been killed with military efficiency, no signs of struggle, no apparent suffering, each child carefully positioned in their own bed with their favorite toy or comfort item placed beside them. The medical examiner would later determine that all 4 children had been subdued with a sedative before being asphyxiated, likely while unconscious, indicating that Alan had planned their deaths carefully to minimize their suffering, a detail that would be presented during the trial, both as evidence of his calculating nature and, paradoxically, as an attempted defense of his character. Martinez noticed something else that struck him as odd. The home contained no photographs or mementos of the children's mother, as if Alan had systematically erased her from their family history after she left, replacing her with his own overwhelming presence in their lives. The first 48 hours of the investigation moved with remarkable speed as authorities issued an all-points bulletin for Alan Johnson, focusing particularly on airports and border crossings. Immigration officials at Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport detained him on the evening of September 20th as he attempted to board a one-way flight to San Jose, Costa Rica, a non-extradition country where he had reportedly purchased property months earlier. When taken into custody, Johnson was calm and composed, asking only if he could retrieve his carry-on luggage, which contained several journals that would later provide investigators with disturbing insights into his mindset, leading up to the killings. His passport, $50,000 in cash, and a new prepaid phone were found in his possession, supporting the prosecution's later contention that he had carefully planned not just the murders, but also his escape from justice. Detective Martinez would later testify that upon informing Johnson of the charges against him, 4 counts of first-degree murder, the former general showed no visible emotion, simply nodding and asking to speak with his attorney. The Phoenix community reacted with horror and incomprehension as news of the quadruple homicide broke, with makeshift memorials appearing outside the Johnson home within hours of the announcement. Former neighbors and teachers from the children's school described Otto, Jack, Liam, and Kai as bright, well-behaved children who excelled academically and participated in numerous extracurricular activities, from Otto's passion for astronomy to Liam's talent for piano, Jack's prowess on the soccer field, and young Kai's artistic abilities. However, several acquaintances also noted that the children seemed unusually reserved around their father, exhibiting what one teacher described as a military-like discipline that seemed at odds with their young ages. Alan had enrolled all 4 children in various competitive programs, from academic Olympiads to sports leagues, and expected nothing short of excellence from them. A reflection, prosecutors would later argue, of the same controlling tendencies he had exhibited in his marriage and military career. As Detective Martinez delved deeper into Alan Johnson's recent history, a troubling timeline began to emerge that would form the backbone of the prosecution's case. Financial records revealed that Johnson had liquidated significant investments in early August, transferring large sums to offshore accounts and purchasing the property in Costa Rica shortly thereafter. His browser history, obtained through a search warrant for his electronic devices, showed extensive research on countries without extradition treaties with the United States, methods of creating new identities, and, most disturbingly, searches for painless death and sedatives dosage for children in the weeks leading up to September 18th. Phone records revealed frequent calls to a number belonging to Rachel Thomas, a 28-year-old administrative assistant at the defense contractor where Johnson had worked since his retirement from the military, with a noticeable increase in call frequency and duration beginning in early September and culminating in a 47-minute call on the evening of September 17th, the night before the murders. Within 3 days of his arrest, Alan Johnson appeared for his initial court appearance before Judge Elaine Harmon of the Maricopa County Superior Court, looking markedly different from the commanding military figure he had once been. Dressed in standard-issue orange jail scrubs with his hands and feet shackled, Johnson maintained perfect posture but spoke only to confirm his name and that he understood the charges against him. Prosecutor Emma Wilson, a veteran of the District Attorney's Homicide Bureau, known for her methodical approach to high-profile cases, requested that Johnson be held without bail, citing the severity of the charges, his flight attempt, and the substantial resources at his disposal that made him an exceptional flight risk. Defense attorney Richard Connolly argued briefly that his client's distinguished military service and lack of prior criminal record should be considered, but Judge Harmon ruled in the prosecution's favor, ordering Johnson to be held without bail pending trial. The brief hearing concluded with the scheduling of a preliminary hearing, setting in motion what would become one of the most closely watched criminal cases in Arizona history. That evening, local news stations in Phoenix broadcast footage of the 4 children's school photographs side by side, their bright smiles and innocent expressions creating a stark contrast to the horror of their deaths. The story rapidly gained national attention, with major networks picking up the case of the general who killed his kids, highlighting the shocking contrast between Alan Johnson's distinguished military career and the monstrous crimes of which he stood accused. Military officials issued a terse statement, expressing shock and emphasizing that Johnson's actions in no way reflected the values of the United States Army, while former colleagues seemed stunned, many refusing to believe that the disciplined, respected officer they had known could have committed such atrocities. As dawn broke on the fourth day after the murders, investigators continued to piece together the events leading up to September 18th. Unaware that they were about to uncover the pivotal relationship that would explain Alan Johnson's motive and transform the prosecution's case from circumstantial to compelling. The Maricopa County Courthouse stood imposing against the harsh Phoenix sun on the morning of October 3, 2023, as journalists and spectators gathered for the preliminary hearing in the case of Arizona v. Johnson. The proceedings would take place in Courtroom 4B, a modern space with polished wooden benches and state-of-the-art audiovisual equipment that would be utilized extensively throughout the day as prosecutors began presenting their evidence against the former Army general. Alan Johnson entered the courtroom in handcuffs and leg restraints, escorted by sheriff's deputies who maintained a watchful presence throughout the proceedings, though Johnson himself remained stoically composed, his military bearing evident even in detention garb. Defense attorney Richard Connolly, a former JAG officer who had taken on Johnson's case partly due to their shared military background, sat beside his client with a notepad and several thick binders, occasionally leaning over to whisper something that elicited only the slightest of nods from the defendant. Across the aisle, prosecutor Emma Wilson arranged her materials with methodical precision, her team of 3 assistant prosecutors mirroring her focused demeanor as they prepared to convince Judge Harmon that there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. "The state calls Detective Noah Martinez to the stand," Wilson announced after the preliminary formalities had concluded, her voice clear and authoritative in the hushed courtroom. Martinez approached the witness stand with the measured steps of someone accustomed to testifying, his dark suit crisp and his expression somber as he was sworn in and took his seat, adjusting the microphone slightly before meeting the prosecutor's gaze. Wilson began by establishing Martinez's credentials and his role in the investigation, methodically laying the groundwork before directing him to describe what had been discovered at the Johnson residence on September 19th. Detective Martinez's testimony was clinical, yet powerful, detailing the scene with professional detachment that nonetheless conveyed the horror of finding 4 children carefully arranged in their beds, positioned as if sleeping, but bearing the unmistakable pallor of death, their rooms immaculately clean and organized with military precision. "Detective Martinez, I'd like to direct your attention to People's Exhibit 1, Wilson said, nodding to her assistant who displayed a document on the courtroom's large screen. "Can you identify this document for the court?" "Yes, this is a certified letter that was received by Catherine Smith, the ex-wife of the defendant, on September 19, 2023. Martinez replied, his voice steady, as he explained how the letter had prompted the welfare check that led to the discovery of the children's bodies. The envelope was postmarked September 17th from Phoenix, and inside was this single sheet of paper with a handwritten message, "You'll never get them back," and signed simply, A. Forensics has confirmed the handwriting matches samples of the defendant's writing from his military personnel file and personal journals. The courtroom fell silent as Wilson projected the actual letter onto the screen, the 7 words written in precise, controlled penmanship that seemed to embody the calculating nature of the crimes themselves. Judge Harmon leaned forward slightly, studying the exhibit, as Wilson continued her questioning, establishing through Martinez's testimony that the letter had been mailed the day before the murders occurred, providing critical evidence of premeditation. Defense attorney Connolly objected several times during this line of questioning, arguing that the interpretation of the letter's meaning was speculative, But Judge Harmon overruled each objection, allowing Martinez to explain the significance of the timing in relation to the medical examiner's determined time of death. The detective further testified that when shown the letter during his initial interview, Alan Johnson had neither confirmed nor denied writing it, simply stating that he wished to exercise his right to remain silent, a response that could not legally be held against him, but that had nevertheless struck Martinez as telling, given the circumstances. Detective, did your investigation uncover any evidence regarding the defendant's future plans after September 18th? Wilson asked, transitioning to another key aspect of their case. Martinez nodded, explaining that Johnson had purchased a one-way ticket to Costa Rica, scheduled for departure on September 20th, 2 days after the murders, and had made arrangements for a car service to take him to Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport. Evidence recovered from Johnson's home office included printouts of Costa Rican property laws, a deed to a remote property purchased 3 months earlier through a shell corporation, and Spanish-language instruction materials, all suggesting extensive preparation for relocation to a country that has no extradition treaty with the United States. When questioned about these items during a subsequent interview with his attorney present, Johnson had claimed they were related to retirement planning, an explanation that investigators found implausible given the hasty timeline and the secretive nature of the arrangements. The preliminary hearing took a dramatic turn when Wilson introduced People's Exhibit 7, a series of text messages retrieved from Alan Johnson's phone between him and a contact identified as RT. The messages, displayed on the courtroom screen and read aloud by Martinez, revealed an increasingly tense exchange, culminating in a final message from RT dated September 15th that stated, "I can't do this anymore, Alan. If you don't fix your situation by the 18th, I'm getting the abortion and moving back to Denver. This is your last chance." Defense attorney Connolly immediately objected, arguing that the messages lacked context and that there was no proper foundation establishing the identity of RT or the meaning of your situation. But Judge Harmon allowed the evidence, noting that the prosecution would have the opportunity to establish these connections through subsequent testimony. Martinez then revealed that RT had been identified as Rachel Thomas, a 28-year-old woman who had worked under Johnson at Meridian Defense Systems and who was approximately 14 weeks pregnant at the time of the murders. The afternoon session of the preliminary hearing focused on forensic evidence, with the medical examiner, Dr. Layla Patel, testifying to the cause and manner of death for each of the Johnson children. Her testimony was clinically precise yet deeply disturbing, detailing how toxicology reports indicated the presence of a powerful sedative in all 4 children's systems, followed by asphyxiation while they were unconscious. The defendant used his knowledge of pharmaceuticals, likely acquired during his military career, to ensure the children would not resist or suffer, Dr. Patel explained, her voice steady despite the grim nature of her findings. The manner of death was consistent across all 4 victims: administration of sedatives, followed by asphyxiation using a pillow or similar soft object, with death occurring between 7 p.m. and 10 p.m. on September 18, 2023. Judge Harmon called for a brief recess after Dr. Patel's testimony, noting the evident distress among several jurors and spectators in the courtroom. During the 15-minute break, Alan Johnson remained seated at the defense table, occasionally consulting with his attorney, but displaying no visible reaction to the detailed descriptions of his children's deaths that had just been presented. Catherine Smith, seated in the front row of the gallery, wept silently into a tissue, comforted by a victim advocate from the prosecutor's office who had been assigned to support her throughout the proceedings. Several rows behind them, Rachel Thomas sat alone, her pregnancy now visibly showing, her expression a complex mixture of horror and guilt as she awaited her turn to testify, a moment that prosecutors had indicated would come later in the preliminary hearing once the physical evidence had been fully presented. When court resumed, Wilson called digital forensics expert Aidan Park to testify about data recovered from Johnson's personal and work devices. Park's testimony revealed a disturbing pattern of searches beginning approximately 6 weeks before the murders, including queries about undetectable poisons, countries with no extradition, and how to disappear completely. The most damning searches, according to Park, occurred in the 72 hours before September 18th, when Johnson had researched specific dosages of various sedatives for children 40-50 pounds, and had visited websites discussing methods of suffocation that would leave minimal external evidence. Defense attorney Connolly cross-examined Park aggressively, questioning the authentication procedures used to verify that Johnson himself had conducted these searches, and suggesting that Johnson's home network had been unsecured, potentially allowing others to use his devices. Park maintained that user account information and password protections made it extremely unlikely that anyone other than Johnson had conducted the searches, and Wilson later reinforced this point by introducing evidence that the same searches had been conducted on Johnson's password-protected work laptop during hours when he was verified to be at his desk. As the afternoon wore on, Wilson shifted focus to Johnson's financial activities in the months leading up to the murders, calling forensic accountant Teresa Vasquez to testify about the defendant's systematic liquidation of assets. Vasquez detailed how Johnson had sold investments worth approximately $1.2 million between July and September 2023, converting much of the proceeds to cash and transferring the remainder to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. The defendant's financial maneuvers were consistent with someone preparing to leave the country permanently and establish a new life elsewhere, Vasquez testified, pointing to PowerPoint slides that illustrated the timeline of transactions. Particularly notable was the purchase of property in Costa Rica through a shell corporation not directly traceable to Mr. Johnson, as well as the opening of a bank account in San Jose under the name Alan Jenkins, a slight variation of his real name that would nonetheless allow him to access funds while maintaining plausible deniability. The day's final witness was Catherine Smith herself, Alan Johnson's ex-wife, and the mother of the 4 murdered children, whose testimony provided critical context for the relationship dynamics that had preceded the tragedy. Smith, composed but visibly emotional, described her 12-year marriage to Johnson as increasingly controlling and isolating, with Johnson's military career providing both a justification for his rigid expectations and frequent absences that strained their relationship. When I finally left in 2016, I tried to take the children with me, but Alan threatened to use his military connections and resources to destroy me legally if I pursued custody, Smith testified, her voice breaking slightly as she recounted her impossible choice. He told me that no judge would award custody to me over a decorated Army officer, and I was so broken by then that I believed him. I've spent the last 7 years trying to rebuild my life and financial stability so I could finally fight for my children in court. I had just filed for custody review 3 weeks before they were killed. The second day of the preliminary hearing began with heightened security as word spread that Rachel Thomas would be testifying about her relationship with Alan Johnson and the ultimatum that prosecutors alleged had triggered the murders. The courtroom was filled to capacity, with spectators and journalists arriving hours before proceedings began to secure seats for what promised to be compelling testimony. Alan Johnson appeared more animated than on the previous day, conferring frequently with defense attorney Richard Connolly and occasionally shaking his head slightly during the prosecution's opening remarks. Judge Harmon began by addressing several motions filed overnight, including the defense's attempt to exclude Rachel Thomas's testimony on grounds of relevance and prejudice, which the judge denied after hearing arguments from both sides. The alleged relationship between the defendant and Ms. Thomas, particularly any ultimatum regarding her pregnancy, goes directly to motive and premeditation, Judge Harmon ruled, adding that the probative value of such testimony substantially outweighed any prejudicial effect. Prosecutor Emma Wilson called Rachel Thomas to the stand at precisely 9:42 a.m., all eyes in the courtroom following the young woman's slow, deliberate walk to the witness stand. Visibly pregnant at approximately 20 weeks, Thomas wore a simple gray maternity dress and minimal jewelry, her composure betrayed only by her tightly clasped hands as she was sworn in. Wilson began gently, establishing that Thomas had worked as an administrative assistant at Meridian Defense Systems, where Johnson had been employed as a senior consultant following his military retirement. Thomas testified that their relationship had begun professionally but developed into a romantic involvement approximately 10 months earlier. Conducted in secret due to workplace policies against supervisor-subordinate relationships. Alan was very careful about keeping our relationship private, Thomas testified, her voice steady despite the tension evident in her posture. He told me he was divorced and single, though he mentioned having 4 children who lived with him, and who he described as complicated due to their special needs. As Wilson guided her testimony forward, Thomas revealed that she had discovered her pregnancy in July 2023 and initially kept it secret from Johnson, fearing his reaction given his frequent comments about not wanting more children. When I finally told him in early August, he became very distant, telling me it was bad timing and suggesting I consider termination, Thomas stated, occasionally glancing at Johnson, who maintained a stoic expression. But after a few days he seemed to change his mind, telling me he would handle everything so we could be together properly. He started talking about moving somewhere tropical, starting fresh, but he was always vague about what that meant for his existing children. The courtroom fell completely silent as Wilson approached the critical testimony about the ultimatum, asking Thomas to describe the events of early September that had preceded the murders. Thomas explained that as her pregnancy progressed, she had become increasingly uncomfortable with Johnson's secrecy and apparent reluctance to introduce her to his children or make concrete plans for their future together. I realized he had been lying about many things, the nature of his divorce, his financial situation, even where he lived some of the time, she testified, her voice finally breaking slightly. I found out he was still legally entangled with his ex-wife in some way, though he wouldn't explain how. I was starting to feel like a secret he was ashamed of, and I worried about bringing a child into such an unstable situation. Wilson projected a series of text messages on the courtroom screen, asking Thomas to verify their authenticity and explain the context. Thomas confirmed that the increasingly frustrated messages were indeed hers, culminating in the September 15th ultimatum that Detective Martinez had referenced the previous day. "I can't do this anymore, Alan. If you don't fix your situation by the 18th, I'm getting the abortion and moving back to Denver. This is your last chance." When Wilson asked what Thomas had meant by "fix your situation," her answer was devastatingly simple. "I wanted him to acknowledge our relationship publicly, introduce me to his children, and make concrete plans for us to build a life together. I had no idea that he would interpret that as meaning he needed to eliminate his children from the equation." Defense attorney Richard Connolly's cross-examination of Rachel Thomas was aggressive, attempting to portray her as a manipulative homewrecker who had pursued a relationship with Johnson despite knowing he was a single father with significant responsibilities. Thomas remained composed throughout, acknowledging that she had been aware of the impropriety of dating her supervisor, but insisting that Johnson had actively pursued her and had repeatedly assured her that his personal life would not be an obstacle to their relationship. Connolly pressed particularly hard on the ultimatum, suggesting that Thomas had deliberately pressured Johnson during a vulnerable time, knowing that he was facing potential custody proceedings from his ex-wife. "Isn't it true that you gave Mr. Johnson an impossible choice? Choose between his existing children and his unborn child, knowing that he was already under extreme stress?" Connolly demanded, his voice sharp in the quiet courtroom. "No, that's not true at all," Thomas replied firmly, meeting the defense attorney's gaze directly for the first time during cross-examination. "I never asked him to choose between his children and our baby. I asked him to integrate his life honestly, to stop compartmentalizing everything, and to be truthful with me and with them. The deadline wasn't arbitrary. It was when I had scheduled an appointment to discuss termination options, which I felt was my right given the circumstances. I never imagined he would do what he did. I thought the worst that would happen was that we would break up." The afternoon session began with testimony from Johnson's former military colleagues, providing crucial insight into his character and behavior patterns during his Army career. Colonel Marcus Hendricks, who had served with Johnson during 2 deployments and later supervised him at Pentagon headquarters, described the defendant as brilliant but rigid, with an exceptional ability to compartmentalize and focus on objectives to the exclusion of all else. General Johnson had a remarkable capacity for making difficult decisions under pressure, which made him valuable in combat situations but sometimes problematic in interpersonal contexts, Hendricks testified, choosing his words carefully as he glanced at his former colleague. He was known for maintaining strict control over his operational environment and became noticeably agitated when that control was threatened or when plans needed to be changed unexpectedly. Lieutenant Colonel Sofia Rivera, who had worked directly under Johnson's command for 3 years, provided more pointed testimony about his interpersonal dynamics, characterizing him as charismatic but controlling in his leadership style. The general could be incredibly charming when he wanted something, inspiring loyalty and admiration from those under his command, Rivera stated, her military bearing evident even in civilian clothes. But there was always an undercurrent of rigid expectation. He demanded perfection from his subordinates and would become coldly distant if you disappointed him. Several junior officers were reduced to tears after private meetings with him, though he never raised his voice or used inappropriate language. It was his ability to make you feel utterly worthless with just a look or a few precisely chosen words. When Prosecutor Wilson asked if Rivera had ever observed Johnson interacting with his children during military functions, her testimony became particularly relevant to the case at hand. "Yes, on several occasions when family members were invited to base events, I observed General Johnson with his 4 children," Rivera confirmed, her expression somber. "What struck me was how they behaved around him. They were incredibly well behaved, almost unnaturally so for children their age. They stood at attention when he addressed them, responded with 'yes, sir' to his questions, and seemed to operate according to some predetermined protocol for public appearances. I remember commenting to a colleague that they seemed more like small soldiers than children, and he responded that the general runs his home like he runs his battalion, with absolute discipline." Judge Harmon called for the day's final witness at 3:45 p.m., and the prosecution called Dr. Eleanor Hughes, a forensic psychologist who had been permitted to review Johnson's military psychological evaluations, personal journals seized from his residence, and interviews with colleagues and acquaintances. Dr. Hughes had not personally evaluated Johnson, a point that defense attorney Connolly emphasized repeatedly during his objections to her testimony, but Judge Harmon allowed her to testify as an expert witness regarding behavioral patterns consistent with the evidence collected. Dr. Hughes characterized Johnson's psychological profile as consistent with a highly compartmentalized personality with significant control needs and difficulty processing emotional attachments in healthy ways. Based on the materials I've reviewed, Johnson appears to have viewed relationships primarily through the lens of possession and control, rather than emotional connection, Dr. Hughes testified, her academic tone providing a clinical distance from the disturbing content of her analysis. His journals reveal a person who categorized people in his life as either assets or liabilities, including his children, whom he frequently described in terms of their achievements and compliance, rather than expressions of love or enjoyment of their company. Particularly notable was the increasing frequency of entries regarding his children as complications or obstacles in the months leading up to their deaths, coinciding with entries about a new relationship that represented a fresh start and freedom from past mistakes. As the second day of the preliminary hearing concluded, Judge Harmon addressed the gallery, acknowledging the emotional nature of the testimony and reminding everyone that the purpose of the proceedings was to determine whether sufficient evidence existed to proceed to trial. The judge then turned to Alan Johnson, who had remained impassive throughout most of the day's testimony, showing visible reaction only during Rachel Thomas's description of their relationship. Mr. Johnson, based on the evidence presented over these 2 days, I find that there is probable cause to believe that you committed the crimes with which you have been charged, Judge Harmon stated formally. You are hereby bound over for trial in the Superior Court of Maricopa County on 4 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances. Arraignment is scheduled for October 24th at 9:01 a.m. in this courtroom. As Johnson was led from the courtroom by sheriff's deputies, the reality of what lay ahead seemed to finally register on his face, a momentary crack in his composed demeanor quickly masked but noticed by several journalists in the front row. Outside the courthouse, a growing memorial of stuffed animals, children's drawings, and candles honored the memory of Otto, Jack, Liam, and Kai Johnson, their school photographs displayed amid the tokens of community grief. Rachel Thomas exited through a side door, escorted by victim advocates to avoid the press gathered on the courthouse steps, her testimony having transformed her in the public narrative from suspected accomplice to another victim of Alan Johnson's manipulation and deadly decision-making. As twilight fell over Phoenix, prosecutors Emma Wilson and her team gathered in their offices to prepare for the next phase of what would undoubtedly be one of the most closely watched trials in Arizona history. The weight of 4 young lives lost, driving their methodical pursuit of justice. The Maricopa County Superior Courthouse buzzed with tense anticipation on the morning of January 8, 2024, as jury selection for the trial of Arizona v. Johnson concluded and opening statements were scheduled to begin. After 3 weeks of careful vetting, 12 jurors and 4 alternates had been seated, a diverse group that included a retired nurse, a high school physics teacher, a construction foreman, and a social worker, among others, all of whom had convinced both sides that they could impartially evaluate the evidence despite the case's high profile in the Phoenix community. Courtroom 6A had been specially prepared for what was expected to be a 6-week trial with enhanced audiovisual capabilities, additional seating for the public and press, and a separate room where family members could watch proceedings via closed-circuit television if they found the testimony too difficult to bear in person. Judge Victoria Sandoval, who had taken over the case following Judge Harmon's recusal due to a previously undisclosed connection to Johnson's military career, entered promptly at 9:00 a.m., her reputation for running an efficient courtroom immediately evident as she addressed several outstanding motions before inviting the prosecution to begin. Lead prosecutor Emma Wilson approached the jury box with measured steps, her charcoal gray suit and minimal jewelry projecting professionalism and gravity appropriate to the charges at hand. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about 4 children, Otto, Jack, Liam, and Kai Johnson, whose lives were taken by the one person who should have protected them above all others, their father, Wilson began, her voice clear and steady in the silent courtroom. The evidence will show that the defendant, Alan Johnson, a former Army general accustomed to control and precision, methodically planned and executed the murder of his 4 children on September 18, 2023. Sedating them before suffocating each one in turn, arranging their bodies as if they were sleeping, and then attempting to flee the country to escape accountability for his actions. This was not a crime of passion or a moment of mental breakdown, but a calculated decision made by a man who viewed his children as obstacles to the new life he wanted to create. Wilson moved to a large display screen where she showed photographs of each child, not crime scene photos, but school portraits showing bright smiles and innocent eyes as she introduced them to the jury. Otto Johnson was 10 years old, a 4th grader who loved astronomy and could name every planet and major constellation. Jack Johnson, also 10, was a gifted soccer player who had recently been selected for a competitive youth league. Liam Johnson, 9, was learning to play piano and had performed in his school's talent show just 2 weeks before his death. And Kai Johnson, the youngest at 8, was the only girl among the siblings, artistic and gentle, who filled sketchbooks with colorful drawings that were found stacked neatly on her desk. The prosecutor then methodically outlined the timeline of events that the state would prove, beginning with Alan Johnson's relationship with Rachel Thomas and her pregnancy, which had presented him with a dilemma: his existing family or his new beginning. When Ms. Thomas gave the defendant an ultimatum on September 15th to fix his situation by September 18th, or she would terminate her pregnancy and end their relationship, she meant for him to acknowledge their relationship publicly and make honest plans for their future. But the evidence will show that Johnson interpreted this ultimatum in the most extreme way possible, not as a call to integrate his responsibilities, but as permission to eliminate what he had come to view as the primary obstacle to his fresh start. Wilson then detailed the physical evidence and witness testimony the prosecution would present, including the certified letter to Catherine Smith stating, "You'll never get them back," the one-way ticket to Costa Rica scheduled for September 20th, financial records showing Johnson's liquidation of assets, and digital evidence of his research into methods of killing that would appear peaceful and countries without extradition treaties. The defendant's own journals, which you will see excerpts from, reveal a man who increasingly viewed his children as burdens rather than blessings, referring to them as anchors and complications. In his efforts to rebuild his life after military retirement, Wilson continued, her voice taking on an edge of controlled indignation. In one entry dated just 2 weeks before the murders, he wrote, "4 lives standing between me and freedom. I've sacrificed everything for them, and now they're the final obstacle to happiness." Wilson concluded her opening statement by addressing the defense's anticipated arguments head-on. You may hear claims about the defendant's distinguished military service, about the stresses of single parenthood, or about temporary insanity. But the evidence will show that Alan Johnson was not insane. He was calculating. He was not overwhelmed. He was strategic. And he was not protecting his children from some imagined harm. He was eliminating them to serve his own desires. At the conclusion of this trial, we will ask you to return the only verdict that justice demands, guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances. Defense attorney Richard Connolly rose from his seat as Wilson returned to the prosecution table, straightening his tie before approaching the jury with a confident stride that reflected his years as a military prosecutor before entering private practice. Ladies and gentlemen, there is no question that a terrible tragedy occurred on September 18, 2023. 4 young lives were indeed lost, and nothing can bring those children back, Connolly began, his tone somber but controlled. But this case is not as simple or straightforward as the prosecution would have you believe. It is not about a cold, calculating killer who viewed his children as mere obstacles. It is about a decorated military officer, a single father who had devoted his life to service, first to his country and then to his children, who experienced a perfect storm of psychological pressures that led to a profound break with reality. Connolly moved away from the jury box to stand beside his client, placing a hand briefly on Johnson's shoulder. Alan Johnson served this country with distinction for over 20 years, rising to the rank of general through intelligence, dedication, and sacrifice. When his wife abandoned the family in 2016, leaving him solely responsible for 4 young children, he did not shirk that responsibility. He arranged his military career around their needs, eventually retiring to provide more stability, and by all accounts, his children were well cared for, educated, and involved in enriching activities. The defense attorney then pivoted to address the prosecution's evidence regarding Johnson's relationship with Rachel Thomas, offering an alternative interpretation. Yes, Alan Johnson became involved with Ms. Thomas. Yes, she became pregnant and presented him with an ultimatum. But the state's characterization of his response is fundamentally flawed, Connolly argued, his voice gaining intensity. The evidence will show that Mr. Johnson had been suffering from undiagnosed and untreated post-traumatic stress disorder from his combat experiences, exacerbated by the immense stress of single parenthood and the recent threat of a custody battle from his ex-wife, who had suddenly reappeared after years of absence. The combination of these stressors, along with Ms. Thomas's ultimatum, triggered a dissociative episode during which Mr. Johnson was not capable of understanding the nature or consequences of his actions. Connolly then introduced the central theme of the defense, that Johnson believed he was protecting his children rather than harming them. Military psychologists will testify about a phenomenon observed in combat veterans with PTSD, where the line between protecting and destroying can become fatally blurred under extreme stress. Mr. Johnson's journals, which the prosecution has selectively quoted, also contained entries expressing fear that his ex-wife would take the children and subject them to the same emotional neglect she had inflicted before abandoning them. In his dissociated state, Alan Johnson tragically came to believe that the only way to protect his children from future suffering was to send them peacefully to another plane of existence. The defense's opening statement concluded with a direct challenge to the jury to maintain objectivity despite the emotional nature of the case. The prosecution will show you heart-wrenching photographs and play on your natural sympathy for 4 innocent children whose lives were cut short. That sympathy is appropriate and human. But your duty in this courtroom is to evaluate the evidence not through the lens of emotion, but through the lens of law, including the legal standard for criminal responsibility when mental illness is involved. We ask only that you keep an open mind, consider the full context of Mr. Johnson's life and mental state, and ultimately recognize that this case involves tragedy rather than calculated evil. After a brief recess, the trial proceeded with the prosecution's first witnesses, beginning with Detective Noah Martinez, who walked the jury through the discovery of the crime scene with the assistance of carefully selected photographs that showed the layout of the Johnson home without unduly graphic images of the victims. Martinez described the methodical nature of the scene, each child in their own bed, covered with blankets pulled neatly to their chins, favorite toys or comfort items placed beside them, and no signs of struggle or disturbance in the immaculate home. Based on my 15 years of experience investigating homicides, the scene was consistent with someone who had planned the deaths carefully and executed that plan with precision, Martinez testified, noting the absence of defensive wounds on the children and the presence of sedatives in the empty juice glasses found in the kitchen sink. The prosecution then called Catherine Smith, whose testimony about receiving the letter from Johnson on September 19th provided a crucial timeline element. Smith maintained remarkable composure as she identified the letter and explained her immediate reaction upon reading the words, "You'll never get them back." I knew something was terribly wrong, Smith testified, her voice steady despite the emotion evident in her expression. Alan had always been controlling about the children, limiting my access and communication with them after our divorce, but this felt different, more final. When I couldn't reach any of them by phone, I called the police for a welfare check, fearing that he might have taken them out of the country to prevent the custody hearing I had recently requested. The prosecution's strategy for the remainder of the day focused on establishing the timeline of Alan Johnson's actions in the days leading up to September 18th, calling witnesses who could place his movements and decisions in a clear sequence that demonstrated premeditation and intent. Travel agent Melissa Huang testified about Johnson's purchase of a one-way ticket to Costa Rica scheduled for September 20th, made on September 16th with cash and instructions for seat selection that would allow for quick deplaning. Bank manager Trevor Phillips detailed Johnson's unusual financial activities, including large cash withdrawals and the transfer of substantial funds to offshore accounts beginning approximately 6 weeks before the murders. And real estate broker Carlos Mendez, appearing via video link from San Jose, Costa Rica, confirmed that Johnson had purchased a remote property through a shell company, with the transaction finalized just 10 days before the murders. The most damning testimony of the day came from Johnson's former colleague at Meridian Defense Systems, security specialist Brandon Foster, who described a conversation with the defendant in early September that had seemed innocuous at the time but took on sinister meaning in retrospect. We were having lunch in the company cafeteria when Alan mentioned that he was considering downsizing his life and asked me theoretically about using sedatives to manage anxiety during air travel, Foster recalled, his discomfort at providing evidence against a former friend evident in his reluctant tone. He specifically asked about dosages for children, claiming his kids got nervous flying. He also asked about Costa Rica, mentioning he'd heard it was a good place to start over, and specifically asked if I knew whether they had an extradition treaty with the U.S., which struck me as an odd question at the time. As the court adjourned for the day, the prosecution had effectively established the foundational elements of their case: Johnson's motive, his careful preparations for escape, and the calculated nature of the murders themselves. Emma Wilson approached the bench to inform Judge Sandoval that the next day's testimony would focus on the forensic evidence, including the medical examiner's findings and toxicology reports, warning that some of the material would necessarily be graphic despite their efforts to present it as clinically as possible. In the gallery, Rachel Thomas sat with her hands protectively cradling her now visible pregnancy, her expression haunted, as she watched the deputies lead Alan Johnson from the courtroom, the father of her unborn child, and the man whose interpretation of her ultimatum had resulted in 4 deaths and irrevocably altered countless lives, including her own. The third day of the trial began with testimony from Dr. Layla Patel, the Maricopa County medical examiner, who had performed the autopsies on all 4 Johnson children. Dr. Patel's testimony was clinical but respectful, balancing the jury's need to understand the medical evidence with sensitivity to the emotional impact of such details. Using anatomical diagrams rather than actual autopsy photographs whenever possible, she explained that all 4 children had died from asphyxiation, most likely by smothering with a pillow or similar soft object, after being sedated with a combination of benzodiazepines and over-the-counter sleep aids. The toxicology reports indicated that each child had consumed the sedatives approximately 30 to 45 minutes before death, consistent with the theory that they were given the substances in beverage form and then suffocated once unconscious, Dr. Patel testified, indicating the timeline that placed the deaths between 7:30 p.m. and 9:15 p.m. on September 18, 2023. When Prosecutor Wilson asked about any differences between the 4 cases, Dr. Patel noted a significant detail. The order of deaths appears to have been from youngest to oldest, based on body temperature and post-mortem indicators. Kai Johnson was likely killed first, followed by Liam, then Jack, with Otto being the last. This suggests a methodical progression rather than simultaneous action, with approximately 20-30 minutes between each death. This testimony visibly affected several jurors, particularly juror number 8, a mother of 3, who briefly closed her eyes as if to compose herself before continuing to take notes. Defense attorney Connolly's cross-examination focused primarily on whether the children would have suffered, with Dr. Patel confirming that the sedation would have rendered them unconscious and unaware during the asphyxiation process, a point the defense would later incorporate into their argument about Johnson's distorted belief that he was protecting his children from suffering. The prosecution then called toxicologist Dr. Maya Rodriguez, who provided expert testimony about the specific combination of medications found in the children's systems. The presence of both prescription-strength benzodiazepines and over-the-counter diphenhydramine suggests knowledge of pharmacological interactions that would potentiate sedative effects, Dr. Vierce, Rodriguez explained, noting that such combinations are well known in medical and military contexts for their synergistic properties. Additionally, the dosages were carefully calculated based on each child's approximate body weight, resulting in rapid sedation without immediate life-threatening overdose, indicating that the intent was to render them unconscious, but not to kill them with the drugs themselves. This technical testimony was followed by digital forensics expert Aidan Park, returning to the stand to present evidence recovered from Johnson's personal and work computers. Park methodically walked the jury through Johnson's search history in the weeks leading up to the murders, displaying screenshots that showed queries for untraceable sedatives, painless death children, Costa Rica non-extradition, and how to make children sleep deeply. Particularly damning was a sequence of searches from September 17th that included how long to hold pillow for suffocation, can suffocation be detected in autopsy, and peaceful death while sleeping. Defense attorney Connolly objected repeatedly to this evidence, arguing that the searches could be interpreted in multiple ways and that no direct connection could be established between research and intent. But Judge Sandoval overruled, allowing the jury to see the full chronology of Johnson's online activities. The afternoon session brought the most anticipated testimony of the trial thus far, as Catherine Smith returned to the stand for extended questioning about her marriage to Alan Johnson, their divorce, and her subsequent attempts to maintain a relationship with her children. Smith, dressed in a simple navy blue dress and wearing a small pendant containing photographs of her 4 children, appeared composed but emotionally raw as she recounted the controlling nature of her relationship with Johnson from its earliest days. Alan was charming and attentive when we first met at a military fundraiser in 2005, but after we married in 2007, his true personality began to emerge, Smith testified, occasionally glancing at her former husband, who maintained a stoic expression at the defense table. He approached our marriage like a military operation with strict schedules, expectations, and consequences for what he perceived as failures or insubordination. Smith described how Johnson's controlling behavior intensified after the birth of their first child, Otto, in 2013, and escalated with each subsequent pregnancy. Alan had specific ideas about child rearing based on his military background, implementing what he called protocols for everything from feeding schedules to sleep training, she explained, her voice steady despite the painful memories. As the children grew older, he created detailed charts tracking their developmental milestones, academic progress, and behavior, rewarding compliance and punishing deviation from his expectations. When I expressed concern about his rigidity or suggested more nurturing approaches, he would dismiss me as too soft and undermine my authority with the children. Prosecutor Wilson guided Smith through the deterioration of the marriage, establishing how Johnson's controlling behavior had extended to financial abuse and social isolation. By 2015, I had no access to our joint accounts, no friends he hadn't approved, and virtually no say in how our children were raised, Smith testified. When I finally gathered the courage to leave in early 2016, Allen made it clear that if I tried to take the children, he would use his military connections, financial resources, and my lack of independent income to destroy me in court. He told me, "No judge will award custody to an unemployed housewife over a decorated Army officer," and at that point, I believed him. Smith's voice finally broke as she described the impossible choice she had faced. "I made the hardest decision of my life, to leave temporarily without my children so I could establish financial independence and build a case for custody." Allen allowed only limited supervised visits, always on his terms, and gradually reduced even those contacts over time. By 2020, I was only permitted to see the children on major holidays, and by 2022, even those visits had stopped entirely, with Allen claiming the children didn't want to see me because I had abandoned them. When Wilson asked why Smith had filed for custody review in late August 2023, just weeks before the murders, her answer provided crucial context for Johnson's mindset. "Two things happened that made me realize I couldn't wait any longer," Smith explained, wiping away a tear. "First, during a chance encounter at a grocery store in July, I saw the children for the first time in nearly a year, and they looked thin and exhausted, with Otto pulling the younger ones away before they could speak to me. Second, I received an anonymous call from someone at Allen's workplace warning me that he had become increasingly erratic and was talking about moving overseas. That's when I contacted a family law attorney and filed for emergency custody review based on concerns about the children's welfare." Defense attorney Connolly's cross-examination of Catherine Smith was aggressive, attempting to portray her as a mother who had voluntarily abandoned her children and only developed concern when it became convenient. Smith remained composed throughout, acknowledging that leaving without her children had been a desperate measure that she regretted every day, but maintaining that she had never stopped trying to be part of their lives. When Connolly suggested that her custody filing was motivated by financial interest rather than genuine concern, Smith's response was quietly devastating. "I had already survived losing my children once when I left Allen. The thought of losing them permanently was unbearable, but I never imagined he would choose to kill them rather than risk sharing custody. If I had known what he was capable of, I would have done anything, sacrificed anything to protect them." The prosecution concluded the day's proceedings by calling Grace Peters, the children's former nanny, who had worked in the Johnson household from 2017 to 2022. Peters provided critical testimony about Allen Johnson's parenting style and the children's daily lives under his care. The general, that's what we all called him, ran the house like a military installation, Peters recalled, her Australian accent adding a distinctive cadence to her testimony. The children followed a strict schedule posted in every room: wake at 0600 hours, breakfast by 0630, school preparation by 0700, and so on throughout the day. Free play was limited to designated 45-minute blocks, and even then, activities had to be constructive and developmentally appropriate according to his standards. Peters described an incident that had particularly troubled her, occurring approximately 6 months before she left the household. Otto had been selected for a special astronomy program that met on Wednesday evenings, but it conflicted with the family's mandatory dinner time. When Otto asked if he could attend, the general initially refused, saying routine was non-negotiable. Otto persisted, showing unusual courage in standing up to his father, and was punished by having all of his astronomy books and telescope confiscated for a month. What disturbed me most was that the general showed no anger during this interaction. He was coldly logical, explaining to Otto that discipline is maintained through consistent consequences, not emotional responses. As the court adjourned for the day, the prosecution had effectively established not just the how of the murders, but crucial elements of why, painting a picture of Alan Johnson as a controlling figure whose rigid worldview could not accommodate the unpredictability or compromise required for healthy family relationships. Outside the courtroom, media coverage of the trial dominated local news and had begun to attract national attention, particularly after Catherine Smith's emotional testimony, which humanized the four young victims and provided context for their isolated lives under their father's strict control. In her hotel room that evening, prosecutor Emma Wilson reviewed her notes for the next day's proceedings, knowing that Rachel Thomas's testimony would be pivotal in establishing Johnson's motive and state of mind in the days leading up to September 18th, the deadline that had ultimately sealed the fate of four innocent children. The fourth day of the trial began with heightened security as Rachel Thomas, now nearly 6 months pregnant, entered the courtroom through a private entrance to avoid the media gathered outside. Thomas wore a simple black maternity dress, her hair pulled back in a low ponytail, her expression a mixture of determination and visible distress as she was sworn in and took her place on the witness stand. Alan Johnson's demeanor notably shifted as Thomas entered, his previously impassive expression giving way to a momentary flash of what several observers later described as possessiveness before he regained his composure. Prosecutor Emma Wilson approached Thomas gently, establishing the background of her employment at Meridian Defense Systems and her initial professional relationship with Johnson before delving into how their personal involvement had developed. He was extremely charismatic at work, respected by everyone for his military background and strategic thinking, Thomas testified, her voice steady despite her evident discomfort. Our relationship began about 10 months before the children died. It started with coffee discussions about work projects, then lunches, and eventually he asked me to dinner. He told me he was divorced, a single father raising 4 children on his own, which I found admirable. He was careful about keeping our relationship private, which he said was due to company policies against supervisor-subordinate relationships, though I later realized there were many things he was keeping compartmentalized in his life. Wilson guided Thomas through the evolution of their relationship, establishing that Johnson had been attentive and generous, but notably secretive about certain aspects of his life. I never went to his home and never met his children, which he explained by saying they were still processing the divorce and he wanted to introduce me gradually, Thomas explained, occasionally glancing at Johnson, who maintained steady eye contact with her throughout her testimony. He always came to my apartment, or we met at hotels, usually telling me he had arranged childcare. When I would ask about his kids, he would provide brief, almost clinical updates about their activities and achievements, but rarely shared personal stories or seemed emotionally connected to them in the way most parents are when they talk about their children. The courtroom fell completely silent as Wilson directed Thomas to the critical period of her pregnancy discovery and Johnson's reaction. I found out I was pregnant in early July 2023, but I waited almost a month to tell him because I sensed he might not be pleased, Thomas testified, unconsciously placing a protective hand over her abdomen. When I finally told him in August, his initial reaction was troubling. He became very still, very quiet, and then said, "This complicates things," and asked if I had considered all my options. I told him I wanted to keep the baby, and he left my apartment without another word. He didn't contact me for 3 days, and when he finally did, it was as if he'd flipped a switch, suddenly talking about our fresh start and how he would take care of everything. Wilson projected a series of text messages between Thomas and Johnson from late August and early September, asking Thomas to explain the context of the increasingly tense exchanges. Alan became obsessed with the idea of us moving somewhere tropical after the baby was born, talking about Costa Rica repeatedly, and sending me property listings and information about expatriate communities, Thomas explained, her voice beginning to waver slightly. But when I asked practical questions about his children, whether they would come with us, how they would adjust to a new country and language, what schools they would attend, he would become evasive, saying things like, "That will all be resolved," or "Don't worry about those details." The testimony reached its most critical point, as Wilson asked about the ultimatum that prosecutors argued had triggered Johnson's decision to murder his children. By mid-September, I was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with his vagueness about our future and his unwillingness to introduce me to his children or even let me see his home, Thomas stated, tears finally welling in her eyes. I had scheduled an appointment with my doctor for September 19th to discuss termination options because I was seriously questioning whether I wanted to bring a child into what felt like a dishonest situation. On September 15th, I texted him saying that if he didn't fix his situation by the 18th, meaning be honest with me, introduce me to his children, and make concrete plans that included all of us, I would terminate the pregnancy and move back to Denver, where my family lives. Thomas's voice broke completely as she continued. I never for a moment thought that he would interpret fixing his situation as eliminating his children. I meant for him to integrate his life, to stop compartmentalizing everything. When I heard what had happened, I collapsed. I've been in therapy ever since, trying to understand how my words could have been so catastrophically misinterpreted. I have to live with that forever, that my ultimatum, intended to bring honesty to our relationship, somehow contributed to the deaths of 4 innocent children. Defense attorney Richard Connolly's cross-examination of Rachel Thomas was surprisingly brief but pointed, focusing primarily on establishing that she had been aware of Johnson's responsibilities as a single father, yet had continued to pressure him regarding their relationship. Ms. Thomas, you were aware that Mr. Johnson was solely responsible for 4 children, correct? Connolly asked, his tone measured but insistent. And you were aware that he had a high-stress position at Meridian, that he was potentially facing custody proceedings from his ex-wife, and that he had recently been experiencing what colleagues described as unusual anxiety and insomnia, correct? Thomas acknowledged awareness of Johnson's responsibilities but pushed back against the implication that she had been insensitive to his situation. I knew he had children and a demanding job, yes, but he consistently minimized his stress levels when speaking with me. All was projecting complete control and confidence, she responded firmly. As for the custody proceedings, I only learned about those after the fact. Alan had told me his ex-wife was completely out of the picture and had no interest in the children. And regarding his anxiety and insomnia, he never mentioned those to me. He always presented himself as perfectly composed and in command of his life and emotions. Connolly's final question was delivered with subtle but unmistakable accusation. Ms. Thomas, did it never occur to you that presenting a man responsible for 4 children with a choice between those existing children and his unborn child might push someone already under extreme stress to a breaking point? The question drew an immediate and vigorous objection from Prosecutor Wilson, which Judge Sandoval sustained, instructing the jury to disregard it. Thomas, however, insisted on answering despite the sustained objection. That is not what I did. I never asked him to choose between his children and our baby. I asked for honesty and integration. The idea that those children died because of my text is something I will carry forever, but I refuse to accept that asking for basic honesty in a relationship makes me responsible for how he chose to respond. Following a brief recess to allow Thomas to compose herself, the prosecution called Dr. Vanessa Ortiz, a forensic psychiatrist who had reviewed Johnson's military psychological evaluations, personal journals, and post-arrest interviews, though she had not personally evaluated him due to his refusal to cooperate with court-appointed mental health professionals. Dr. Ortiz's testimony directly countered the defense's anticipated argument regarding Johnson's mental state, providing expert opinion that his actions were consistent with a personality disorder characterized by rigid control, needs rather than PTSD or dissociative episodes, as the defense had suggested in opening statements. Based on my review of Mr. Johnson's military psychological assessments over his 20-year career, there is a consistent pattern of traits associated with what we would classify as a controlled and compartmentalized personality style, Dr. Ortiz testified, her academic precision providing a stark contrast to the emotional testimony that had preceded hers. These include exceptional ability to maintain composure under pressure, compartmentalization of emotions, high need for control over environment and relationships, difficulty with emotional intimacy, and tendency to view relationships in transactional rather than emotional terms. While these traits can be adaptive in military contexts, they can become problematic in personal relationships, particularly when the individual's sense of control is threatened. When Prosecutor Wilson asked specifically about the defense's claim that Johnson had experienced a dissociative episode triggered by PTSD, Dr. Ortiz was unequivocal in her assessment. "The evidence does not support that conclusion," she stated firmly. Mr. Johnson's actions before, during, and after the killings demonstrate clear goal-directed behavior, awareness of wrongfulness, and attempts to avoid consequences, all inconsistent with dissociation or psychosis. His military records show no diagnosis of PTSD despite regular psychological evaluations, and his journals in the weeks leading up to the murders show logical, sequential thinking rather than disorganized or delusional content. The entries reveal someone methodically weighing options and consequences, not someone experiencing breaks with reality. Dr. Ortiz then addressed what she considered the most revealing aspect of Johnson's journals, his increasing tendency to categorize his children as obstacles rather than individuals with inherent value. In entries dating back approximately 6 months before the murders, Mr. Johnson began referring to his children with increasing detachment, using phrases like the 4 obstacles to freedom, anchors preventing forward movement, and most tellingly, liabilities on the balance sheet of life, she testified, reading directly from photocopies of journal pages. An entry from September 10th states, 4 lives weighed against 2. The simple math of the situation becomes clearer each day. The 4 represent the past, with all its failures and limitations. The 2 represent the future, unburdened and full of potential. The final witness of the day was FBI Special Agent Marcus Reed, who had been called in to assist the Phoenix police due to his expertise in analyzing crime scenes for behavioral evidence. Agent Reed provided professional analysis of the crime scene, noting the methodical nature of the killings and the care taken to arrange the children's bodies afterward. The positioning of the victims, with each child in their own bed with their favorite comfort item, indicates what we call undoing behavior, an attempt by the perpetrator to symbolically transform a violent act into something peaceful or natural, Reed explained, using diagrams rather than crime scene photos out of respect for the victims. Similarly, the progression from youngest to oldest victim suggests a specific psychological process, possibly related to the perpetrator's perception of the children's vulnerability or their ability to understand what was happening. This was not a chaotic or impulsive crime scene, but one that reflected planning, sequencing, and attention to detail, consistent with someone in complete control of their actions. As the 4th day of testimony concluded, The prosecution had effectively established not only Johnson's motive and means, but had directly countered the defense's mental health arguments before they could be fully presented. Emma Wilson's strategy of front-loading expert testimony about Johnson's psychological state was clearly designed to shape the jury's interpretation of the evidence that would follow, particularly the defendant's own journals and communications. Outside the courtroom, public opinion appeared increasingly aligned against Johnson, with media coverage focusing heavily on Rachel Thomas's emotional testimony and the portrait it painted of a man who compartmentalized his life to such an extreme degree that he could contemplate eliminating one segment entirely when it became inconvenient to his plans for the future. In the defense team's conference room that evening, Richard Connolly and his associates worked late into the night, reassessing their strategy in light of the day's damaging testimony. Their client's insistence on a mental health defense, despite his refusal to undergo psychological evaluation, had created significant challenges, and Thomas's compelling testimony had resonated strongly with the jury based on their visible reactions. As they prepared for the next day's proceedings, which would include forensic analysis of Johnson's electronic devices and testimony from his military supervisors, the defense team knew they were fighting an increasingly uphill battle to create reasonable doubt about their client's criminal responsibility for 4 deaths that no one, not even Johnson himself, disputed he had caused. The 5th day of the trial focused on the forensic examination of Alan Johnson's journals, electronic communications, and financial records, with prosecutors methodically building a timeline of his planning and preparation in the months leading up to the murders. Digital forensics expert Aidan Park returned to the stand to present a comprehensive analysis of Johnson's online activities, including searches related to undetectable poisons, sedation methods, suffocation techniques, and international destinations without extradition treaties with the United States. Using a large screen display, Park showed the jury how Johnson's searches had progressed from general research about starting over abroad in June 2023 to increasingly specific queries about methods of killing that would appear peaceful or natural by early September. The defendant's search patterns show a clear evolution from exploration to implementation, Park testified, displaying a color-coded timeline of Johnson's internet history across his personal laptop, work computer, and mobile devices. Beginning in mid-August, shortly after learning of Ms. Thomas's pregnancy, the searches shift from theoretical to practical, with specific queries about sedative dosages for children in the 40-60 pound range, methods to ensure a victim remains unconscious during asphyxiation, and techniques to make deaths appear natural or accidental. By September 15th, the day Ms. Thomas delivered her ultimatum, the searches become highly specific, including how long after death can police determine time of death, and can police track one-way international flights. Park's testimony was particularly damning when he presented Johnson's digital calendar entries for September 18th, the day of the murders. The calendar, synchronized across Johnson's devices, showed a meticulously planned schedule with time blocks labeled with clinical precision. 4:30 p.m., final preparations. 5 p.m., dinner with medication. 7 p.m., begin protocol. 10 p.m., verification complete, and 11 p.m., finalized travel arrangements. These entries, combined with Johnson's search history and journal writings, provided compelling evidence of premeditation and deliberate planning rather than a sudden dissociative episode, as the defense had suggested. Following Park's testimony, the prosecution called forensic accountant Maya Patel to detail Johnson's financial preparations for flight in the months leading up to the murders. Patel presented evidence showing that Johnson had systematically liquidated approximately $1.7 million in assets between July and September 2023, converting much of it to cash and transferring the remainder to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Belize. The defendant's financial activities in this period are consistent with someone preparing for permanent relocation outside U.S. jurisdiction, Patel testified, pointing to transactions that included the purchase of property in Costa Rica through a shell company, the establishment of a foreign bank account under a slightly altered name, and the conversion of significant assets to untraceable cryptocurrency. The afternoon session brought testimony from Dr. Eliza Monroe, a forensic document examiner who had analyzed Johnson's handwritten journals dating back 2 years before the murders. Dr. Monroe walked the jury through the evolution of Johnson's writing about his children, noting a marked shift in tone and content beginning approximately 8 months before the crimes. In entries from 2021 and early 2022, the defendant references his children primarily in terms of their achievements and development, with occasional expressions of pride, though notably little emotional content, Monroe explained, displaying scanned journal pages with relevant passages highlighted. By early 2023, the references become increasingly detached and logistical, with the children frequently described as responsibilities or obligations rather than individuals. Dr. Monroe then directed the jury's attention to a series of entries from July 2023 forward, corresponding to the period after Johnson learned of Rachel Thomas's pregnancy. In these more recent entries, we see a significant linguistic shift. The children are now consistently referred to collectively rather than individually, and are described using terminology that objectifies them: the four, the obstacles, the complication, she testified, her academic tone providing clinical distance from the disturbing content. Particularly notable is an entry from September the 1st where the defendant writes, "A simple equation has formed in my mind: 4 lives anchored to a failed past versus 2 lives representing unlimited future potential. When framed logically, the correct path becomes unavoidable." The most chilling journal entry, dated September 17th, the day before the murders, was projected on the courtroom screen. "Tomorrow brings resolution. The 4 will be at peace, free from the coming custody battle and Catherine's manipulations. The letter has been sent. She'll understand eventually that this was the only merciful solution. By the time she receives it, the transition will be complete, and within 48 hours, R and I will begin our new life where none can follow or judge. The protocol is established, the timeline confirmed, the necessary materials prepared. There is a strange calm in finally accepting the inevitable mathematics of the situation." Defense attorney Richard Connolly objected vigorously to the journal evidence, arguing that the entries were being presented selectively and without proper psychological context. These writings could equally be interpreted as the increasingly disorganized thoughts of someone experiencing severe psychological distress and dissociation, Connolly argued, requesting that the journals be excluded or at minimum that the defense be permitted to present their own expert interpretation. Judge Sandoval overruled the objection, noting that the defense would have the opportunity to present alternative interpretations during their case, but that the journals themselves were admissible as direct evidence of the defendant's state of mind. The day's final witness was FBI behavioral analyst Dr. Sophia Chen, who provided expert testimony about the psychological patterns evident in both the crime scene and Johnson's writings. Dr. Chen explained that the carefully staged crime scene, with each child positioned as if sleeping with a comfort item, represented what forensic psychologists call undoing, an attempt to symbolically transform a violent act into something peaceful. This type of scene staging is inconsistent with someone experiencing a psychotic break or dissociative episode, Dr. Chen testified, directly challenging the defense's theory. Rather, it suggests someone who was fully aware of the nature and wrongfulness of their actions, but was attempting to create a narrative, both for themselves and for others, that reframes those actions as merciful or protective rather than violent. Dr. Chen then addressed the defense's claim that Johnson had been suffering from undiagnosed PTSD that contributed to a mental break. "The evidence simply doesn't support that conclusion," she stated firmly. Mr. Johnson's journals, digital activities, and crime scene behaviors all demonstrate clear goal-directed thinking, strategic planning, awareness of legal consequences, and attempts to evade those consequences, all inconsistent with a dissociative state. What we see instead is a personality structure characterized by rigid control needs and compartmentalization, combined with an extreme form of cognitive distortion known as emotional arithmetic, the belief that human lives and relationships can be reduced to logical equations with clear solutions. The sixth day of trial began with testimony from Lieutenant Colonel James Harrington, who had served as Johnson's immediate superior during his final 2 years in the Army before retirement. Harrington provided critical context for Johnson's military career and psychological profile, describing him as brilliant but inflexible, and noting that while Johnson had received numerous commendations for strategic planning and operational execution, he had also been passed over for certain leadership advancements due to concerns about his interpersonal skills. General Johnson excelled in contexts that required analytical thinking and decisive action, but struggled in situations that demanded emotional intelligence or flexibility, Harrington testified, his military bearing evident even in civilian clothes. He approached both military operations and personal interactions with the same rigid methodology: identify objectives, eliminate obstacles, execute with precision. When Prosecutor Wilson asked about any concerns regarding Johnson's mental health during his military service, Harrington's response directly contradicted the defense's PTSD claims. General Johnson underwent standard psychological evaluations throughout his career, including comprehensive assessments following combat deployments, and was never diagnosed with PTSD or any other combat-related psychological condition, Harrington stated firmly. In fact, his psychological profiles consistently showed an unusual ability to compartmentalize stress and remain emotionally detached during and after combat operations, a trait that was considered both a strength and a potential concern in his fitness evaluations. The prosecution then called Johnson's former neighbor, Diane Martinez, who had lived next door to the Johnson family for 3 years prior to the murders. Martinez provided testimony about her observations of Johnson's interactions with his children, describing him as meticulously organized but emotionally distant in his parenting style. The children were always immaculately dressed, perfectly behaved, and involved in numerous structured activities, but I rarely saw spontaneous play or affection between them and their father, Martinez recalled, occasionally glancing at Johnson, who remained impassive during her testimony. When they would play in the backyard, it was always during designated time slots, with specific educational toys or sports equipment, and Alan would often observe from the patio, taking notes on what appeared to be a performance evaluation form. Martinez then described an incident approximately 3 months before the murders that had particularly concerned her. "I was in my garden when I overheard Alan speaking to Otto about a science project that had received a B+ rather than an A. He wasn't yelling. In fact, his voice was frighteningly calm, but he was saying things like, 'Failure to achieve excellence is a choice,' and 'second place is simply the first loser.' When Otto began to cry, Alan told him that emotional displays waste energy that could be directed toward improvement, and instructed him to do 50 push-ups before returning to revise the project. Otto was only 10 years old, but he dropped and did the push-ups without argument, as if this was a normal consequence in their household. The prosecution's case reached a powerful emotional crescendo when they called Samantha Johnson, Alan Johnson's sister, who had flown in from Seattle to testify about her brother's childhood and psychological development. Samantha, who bore a striking familial resemblance to the defendant, but whose warm demeanor contrasted sharply with his rigid bearing, provided context for what she described as Alan's lifelong need for absolute control. Even as children, Alan approached life like a military campaign. Everything had to be structured, predictable, and under his direct control, Samantha testified, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. Our parents were both career military, and they encouraged this tendency in him, praising his discipline while overlooking the way he struggled with emotional connections or unexpected changes to routine. Samantha then revealed that she had become concerned about her brother's parenting after visiting the family following Catherine's departure in 2016. I stayed with them for 2 weeks to help with the transition, and what I observed deeply troubled me, she recalled, occasionally wiping away tears. Alan had created what he called the Family Operations Manual, a 3-ring binder containing detailed protocols for everything from morning routines to bedtime procedures, with checklists the children had to complete and have signed off on daily. There was no room for spontaneity, no allowance for the children to simply be children. When I expressed concern, Alan told me that sentiment is inefficient and that he was optimizing the children's development through systematic reinforcement of productive behaviors. When Prosecutor Wilson asked if Samantha had maintained contact with her brother and nieces and nephew after that visit, her answer provided crucial insight into Johnson's isolation of the family. I tried, but Alan gradually restricted my access, claiming my undisciplined influence was disrupting his carefully constructed system, Samantha explained, her voice breaking. The last time I saw the children was Christmas 2020, and they seemed like shadows of themselves, polite and accomplished, but without the spark or joy you expect in children. I called Child Protective Services anonymously after that visit, but when they investigated, everything looked perfect on paper. The children were well fed, enrolled in prestigious schools, involved in enriching activities. What the investigators couldn't measure was the emotional sterility of their environment, the complete absence of spontaneous love or comfort in that house. The day concluded with testimony from Dr. Gabriel Santos, a child psychologist who had reviewed the children's school records, interviews with teachers and activity leaders, and the limited video footage available of the Johnson family in the years leading up to the murders. Dr. Santos provided expert opinion on what he termed extreme developmental regimentation evident in the children's lives. Based on the available evidence, these 4 children were being raised in what we would classify as an emotionally sterile environment, characterized by excessive structure, conditional approval based solely on achievement, and systematic suppression of normal emotional expression, Dr. Santos testified, his gentle demeanor contrasting with the clinical nature of his assessment. While they excelled academically and in structured activities, multiple teachers noted concerns about their limited peer interactions, difficulty with unstructured play, and what one educator described as an almost palpable anxiety about making mistakes or failing to meet expectations. As the court adjourned for the day, the prosecution had effectively established not only the methodical nature of Johnson's preparations and actions, but had provided a comprehensive psychological context that directly countered the defense's claims regarding PTSD or sudden mental break. The cumulative testimony painted a picture of a man whose rigid need for control and emotional detachment had been present throughout his life, culminating in his decision to eliminate his children when they became obstacles to his desired future with Rachel Thomas and their unborn child. In the gallery, Catherine Smith sat with her sister, both wearing blue ribbons that had become symbols of remembrance for the 4 Johnson children, while several rows behind them, Rachel Thomas attended the proceedings for the first time since her testimony. her expression haunted as she listened to the portrait emerging of the man whose child she was carrying. The seventh day of the trial marked a turning point as the prosecution concluded its case and the defense began presenting its alternative narrative of the events surrounding September 18, 2023. Prosecutor Emma Wilson called her final witness, FBI agent Kevin Sanderson, who had interviewed Alan Johnson shortly after his arrest at Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport. Agent Sanderson's testimony focused on Johnson's demeanor and statements during the initial interrogation, describing the defendant as unusually calm and methodical given the circumstances. When informed that he was being arrested for the murders of his 4 children, Mr. Johnson showed no visible emotional reaction, no shock, grief, or distress, Sanderson testified, referring to notes from the interview. His only questions concerned practical matters, whether he could retrieve his carry-on luggage, when he would be able to contact his attorney, and whether the media had been informed of his arrest. Agent Sanderson then described a particularly telling moment during the interrogation, when Johnson was shown photographs of his children taken at the crime scene. Most parents, even those guilty of harming their children, show some emotional response when confronted with such images: distress, remorse, sometimes even anger, Sanderson explained, his expression grave. Mr. Johnson studied each photograph with clinical detachment, then stated, "They look peaceful. That was the intention." When I asked what he meant by that statement, he replied that he wished to exercise his right to remain silent and would not answer further questions without his attorney present. With this final testimony, Prosecutor Wilson formally rested the state's case, having presented 18 witnesses over 7 days and introduced over 200 pieces of evidence documenting Johnson's planning, preparation, execution, and attempted flight following the murders of his 4 children. Judge Sandoval called for a brief recess before the defense would begin its case, during which time Richard Connolly and his team huddled in intense discussion, making last-minute adjustments to their strategy based on the overwhelming evidence presented by the prosecution. As court resumed, the tension in the room was palpable, with many legal observers noting that the defense faced an uphill battle given the comprehensive case the state had constructed. Defense attorney Richard Connolly began his case with an unexpected witness, Major Dr. Elizabeth Reynolds, a military psychiatrist who had served in combat zones and specialized in treating soldiers with combat-related trauma. Dr. Reynolds had not personally treated Johnson, but had reviewed his military records and post-arrest evaluations as an expert witness for the defense. Her testimony directly challenged the prosecution's psychological narrative, suggesting that Johnson's military experiences had indeed left him with undiagnosed PTSD that manifested not in typical symptoms, but in what she termed hyper-controlled response syndrome, an excessive need for order and control as a mechanism for managing underlying trauma. It's not uncommon for high-functioning military personnel, particularly officers, to develop atypical presentations of PTSD that go unrecognized in standard evaluations, Dr. Reynolds testified, her credentials as both a psychiatrist and a decorated military officer lending weight to her opinions. The military culture rewards stoicism and control, which can mask underlying psychological distress. In Mr. Johnson's case, his exceptional ability to compartmentalize emotions and maintain external composure, traits that made him an effective officer, likely prevented both him and military psychologists from recognizing his progressive psychological deterioration. Dr. Reynolds then addressed Johnson's journals and the prosecution's interpretation of them as evidence of calculated planning. What the prosecution characterizes as cold calculation, I see as the writing of someone experiencing increasing dissociation and delusional thinking masked by military language and structure, she argued, pointing to specific passages where Johnson described feeling that his children were under threat from his ex-wife's custody attempt. His references to protocols, transitions, and mercy suggest someone who had developed a delusional belief that he was protecting his children from a greater harm, a common manifestation of dissociative states in which violence is reframed as protection. Prosecutor Wilson's cross-examination of Dr. Reynolds was pointed and effective, focusing on the fact that the doctor had never evaluated Johnson personally, and that her theory of hyper-controlled response syndrome was not a recognized diagnosis in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Reynolds acknowledged these limitations, but maintained that Johnson's behaviors were consistent with atypical PTSD manifestations she had observed in other high-ranking military personnel, particularly those who had experienced combat stress while maintaining command responsibilities. The exchange grew tense when Wilson pressed Reynolds on whether Johnson's elaborate financial preparations and escape planning were also consistent with dissociation, to which Reynolds could only respond that compartmentalized thinking could allow for detailed planning in some areas, while delusional thinking operated in others, an explanation that several jurors appeared to find unconvincing based on their expressions and note-taking. The defense's next witness was Dr. Martin Chen, a neuropsychologist who had been permitted to conduct a limited evaluation of Johnson approximately 3 months after his arrest. Dr. Chen testified that brain imaging studies showed abnormalities consistent with subtle traumatic brain injury in areas associated with emotional processing and impulse control. These findings suggest that Mr. Johnson may have sustained one or more concussive injuries during his military service that went untreated and unrecognized, Dr. Chen explained, displaying brain scans on the courtroom screen. Such injuries can contribute to personality changes, difficulty regulating emotions, impaired judgment, and in some cases, violent behavior that seems out of character, particularly when combined with extreme stress. Wilson's cross-examination quickly established that the brain abnormalities, while present, were subtle and could not definitively be linked to Johnson's actions on September 18th. When pressed, Dr. Chen acknowledged that millions of people have similar minor brain abnormalities without ever committing violent acts, and that the scans could not determine when the injuries might have occurred or whether they had any functional impact on Johnson's behavior or decision-making capacity. The prosecution also introduced evidence that Johnson had passed rigorous neurological and psychological evaluations during his last 2 years of military service, with no indications of cognitive impairment or decision-making deficits noted by military physicians. The defense strategy took a surprising turn when Connolly called Catherine Smith back to the stand, attempting to use her previous testimony about Johnson's controlling nature to support their mental health defense. Mrs. Smith, you testified earlier about Mr. Johnson's rigid parenting style and need for control in your marriage. Would you agree that these traits became more pronounced over time? Connolly asked, his tone respectful but persistent. Smith acknowledged that Johnson's controlling tendencies had indeed intensified during their marriage, particularly after his return from a deployment to Afghanistan in 2014. When Connolly asked if Smith had ever feared that Johnson might harm the children during their marriage, however, her answer undermined the defense's narrative. No, never. Allen was controlling and emotionally distant, but he was never violent toward the children. He viewed them as extensions of himself, projects to be perfected, rather than individuals to be nurtured. I feared for their emotional development, not their physical safety. The 8th day of trial brought the most anticipated testimony. Allen Johnson himself took the stand in his own defense, a high-risk strategy that reflected the defense team's assessment that the evidence against him was so overwhelming that only his direct testimony could potentially sway the jury. Johnson entered the courtroom in a charcoal suit rather than jail attire, a concession granted by Judge Sandoval for his testimony, and appeared more animated than he had throughout the proceedings, making eye contact with jurors as he was sworn in. Defense attorney Connolly began by guiding Johnson through his military background, establishing his distinguished service record, combat experiences, and the psychological demands of command responsibility during wartime deployments. Johnson spoke with precision and clarity about his military career, occasionally using technical terminology that Connolly asked him to explain for the jury's benefit. When the questioning turned to his family life and parenting philosophy, Johnson's demeanor remained composed but took on a defensive quality. I approached parenting with the same principles that had proven effective in my military career: clear expectations, consistent structure, and emphasis on excellence. Johnson testified, his voice steady and unapologetic. Children thrive with boundaries and discipline. My methods may have seemed strict to outside observers, but they were designed to prepare my children for success in a competitive world. Everything I did was for their benefit, to give them advantages I hadn't had. Connolly then carefully guided Johnson through the period following Rachel Thomas's pregnancy announcement, asking about his emotional state and thought processes. Johnson's testimony became more measured, with frequent pauses as if carefully considering his words. When Rachel told me she was pregnant, I felt overwhelmed by the competing responsibilities. I had 4 children who depended entirely on me, a demanding career, and now a new child on the way with a woman who didn't understand the complexities of my situation, Johnson explained, showing the first hints of emotion in his otherwise controlled presentation. When Catherine filed for custody review, it felt like everything was spiraling beyond my control. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus. I began having intrusive thoughts about worst-case scenarios, the children being shuttled between homes, their education and development disrupted, their lives thrown into chaos. The most critical portion of Johnson's testimony concerned the days immediately preceding the murders, where he attempted to provide insight into his mental state as it allegedly deteriorated. After Rachel's ultimatum, something changed in my thinking. I can't explain it clearly even now, but I began to see only one solution that would protect everyone involved, Johnson testified, his voice dropping slightly as he described his thought process. I became convinced that my children would suffer terribly in a custody battle, that Catherine would undo all the stability and structure I had created for them. The thought of them being torn between 2 homes, their potential squandered, became unbearable. In my mind, it became an act of mercy to spare them that future suffering. Johnson then described the evening of September 18th in terms that attempted to support the defense's narrative of dissociation. I remember preparing their favorite meal, helping with homework as usual, but it feels like watching someone else's actions, like viewing a film rather than my own memories. I remember thinking that they should be comfortable, peaceful, not afraid. Each of them went to bed with their favorite item: Otto's astronomy book, Jack's soccer medal, Liam's music box, Kai's stuffed elephant. I wanted them to feel safe. The next clear memory I have is being at the airport, as if hours had simply disappeared. Prosecutor Wilson's cross-examination of Johnson was methodical and devastating, beginning with his description of the evening as dreamlike or dissociative. Mr. Johnson, you've testified that your memories of the evening of September 18th are fragmented and dreamlike, suggesting you were in some sort of dissociative state. Yet you've also described specific details about what comfort items you placed with each child. How do you explain this selective memory? Wilson asked, her tone controlled but insistent. Johnson hesitated before responding that certain details remained clear while others were lost, an explanation that Wilson immediately challenged by producing his digital calendar with its precisely timed schedule for the evening, including entries for begin protocol and verification complete. Wilson then methodically walked Johnson through his extensive preparations, the research into sedatives and suffocation, the financial transfers, the property purchase in Costa Rica, the one-way plane ticket, asking after each item whether these actions were consistent with someone experiencing dissociation or acting on delusional beliefs. Johnson's answers became increasingly defensive as he attempted to maintain his narrative of impaired mental state while accounting for his clearly deliberate actions. The cross-examination reached its most powerful moment when Wilson displayed Johnson's journal entry from September 17th, the day before the murders, and asked him to read it aloud to the jury. Tomorrow brings resolution. The four will be at peace, free from the coming custody battle and Catherine's manipulations. The letter has been sent. She'll understand eventually that this was the only merciful solution. By the time she receives it, the transition will be complete, and within 48 hours, R and I will begin our new life where none can follow or judge. The protocol is established, the timeline confirmed, the necessary materials prepared. There is a strange calm in accepting the inevitable mathematics of the situation. Mr. Johnson, those don't sound like the words of someone experiencing a break with reality, Wilson stated firmly after he finished reading. Those sound like the words of someone who has made a deliberate decision and developed a detailed plan to kill his children and escape the consequences. Isn't that the truth? Johnson maintained that his journals reflected his deteriorating mental state rather than calculated planning, but his explanation appeared unconvincing to several jurors who exchanged glances during his response. The cross-examination's final moments focused on Johnson's claim that he had acted to protect his children from suffering in a custody battle. Mr. Johnson, if your motivation was truly to protect your children from suffering, why didn't you consider other options? Why not seek therapy, request mediation, or propose a cooperative parenting plan with their mother? Wilson asked, her voice reflecting controlled indignation. Why was death the only protection you considered offering them? Johnson's response, that he believed at the time that any other solution would result in their long-term suffering, drew audible reactions from the gallery, particularly from Catherine Smith, whose muffled sob could be heard throughout the courtroom. As Johnson stepped down from the witness stand following 6 hours of testimony, legal observers noted that his decision to testify appeared to have backfired significantly. His controlled demeanor, selective memory, and inability to reconcile his claims of impaired mental state with evidence of detailed planning had likely damaged rather than helped his case. Outside the courthouse, media analysts and legal commentators highlighted the prosecution's effective use of Johnson's own words, from his journals, digital calendar, and text messages, to undermine his narrative of diminished capacity, with several predicting that his testimony might have eliminated any remaining doubt among jurors about his criminal responsibility for the deaths of his 4 children. The 9th day of the trial began with the defense presenting its final witness, Dr. William Hargrove, a prominent forensic psychiatrist who had been permitted to conduct a comprehensive evaluation of Johnson in prison approximately 5 months after his arrest. Dr. Hargrove testified that Johnson exhibited symptoms consistent with what he termed catastrophic psychological decompensation, a severe breakdown in psychological functioning triggered by overwhelming stress and perceived threat to fundamental identity structures. Based on my evaluation and review of the evidence, it is my professional opinion that Mr. Johnson experienced a form of psychological collapse in which his normally rigid control mechanisms failed catastrophically, Dr. Hargrove explained, his distinguished appearance and precise vocabulary lending authority to his testimony. This collapse was precipitated by the convergence of multiple stressors: the pregnancy announcement, the custody filing, the ultimatum from Ms. Thomas, and what Mr. Johnson perceived as the imminent destruction of the carefully controlled life he had constructed. Dr. Hargrove introduced a controversial theory about what he called protective homicide, suggesting that Johnson's actions represented a pathological extension of parental protective instincts rather than malice or disregard for his children's lives. In extremely rare cases, individuals with certain personality structures and under specific types of stress can develop a delusional belief that death is preferable to what they perceive as inevitable suffering, Hargrove testified, acknowledging that this perspective was not universally accepted in the psychiatric community. Mr. Johnson came to believe, through distorted thinking processes, that he was saving his children rather than harming them, that he was exercising the ultimate form of paternal protection by sparing them from what he perceived as a fate worse than death, the disruption of the structured environment he had created for them. Prosecutor Wilson's cross-examination of Dr. Hargrove was methodical and effective, focusing first on establishing that catastrophic psychological decompensation was not a recognized diagnosis in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and that protective homicide was a theoretical construct rather than an established psychiatric concept. Hargrove acknowledged these limitations, but defended the validity of his clinical assessment based on his decades of experience with similar cases. Wilson then directed Hargrove's attention to Johnson's extensive preparations before the murders, asking whether such methodical planning was consistent with psychological decompensation. Dr. Hargrove, you've testified that Mr. Johnson experienced a catastrophic breakdown in psychological functioning. Yet the evidence shows that in the weeks before the murders, he researched methods of killing, prepared sedatives, arranged his financial affairs, purchased property abroad, and bought a one-way ticket to a non-extradition country. How do you reconcile these clearly rational, forward-thinking actions with your theory of psychological collapse? Wilson asked, her skepticism evident in her tone. Hargrove's response that compartmentalized thinking can allow for detailed planning in some domains, while delusional thinking operates in others, seemed to satisfy neither Wilson nor several jurors who frowned visibly during his explanation. The cross-examination reached its most powerful moment when Wilson presented Hargrove with Johnson's journal entries chronologically, demonstrating the progression from viewing his children as complications to explicitly describing them as obstacles to his desired future with Rachel Thomas. Isn't it more consistent with the evidence, Dr. Hargrove, that rather than experiencing some rare form of protective delusion, Mr. Johnson simply made a calculated decision that his 4 existing children were impediments to the new life he wanted to create and eliminated them accordingly? Wilson asked directly. Hargrove maintained his interpretation of Johnson's mental state, but appeared less confident in his responses, acknowledging that the journal entries could support multiple interpretations depending on the theoretical framework applied. Following Dr. Hargrove's testimony, defense attorney Richard Connolly rested his case, having presented 4 expert witnesses and Johnson himself in an attempt to establish that diminished capacity due to mental illness had affected Johnson's ability to form the specific intent required for first-degree murder. Judge Sandoval then called for a brief recess before closing arguments would begin, giving both legal teams time for final preparations. As the courtroom emptied, observers noted that Johnson appeared more animated than he had throughout much of the trial, frequently consulting with his attorneys and reviewing notes, suggesting he recognized the gravity of the jury's impending deliberations. Prosecutor Emma Wilson's closing argument began precisely at 1:30 p.m., with the courtroom filled to capacity and an overflow room established for additional spectators and media. Wilson approached the jury with deliberate steps, carrying no notes, her preparation evident in the fluid structure of her presentation. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, This case, at its core, is tragically simple, she began, her voice resonant in the hushed courtroom. Alan Johnson made a choice. When faced with competing priorities, his existing children versus the new life he envisioned with Rachel Thomas and their unborn child, he chose to eliminate what he had come to view as obstacles to his desired future. This was not a choice made in the grip of delusion or dissociation, but a calculated decision implemented with military precision and followed by a carefully planned escape attempt. Wilson methodically revisited the key evidence, reminding the jury of Johnson's journal entries, chronicling his increasingly detached view of his children, his digital calendar with its chillingly precise schedule for the evening of the murders, his systematic financial preparations for flight, and his one-way ticket to Costa Rica scheduled for just after the crimes. The defense would have you believe that these are the actions of someone experiencing a psychological breakdown, but the evidence tells a different story, Wilson argued, her tone passionate but controlled. These are the actions of someone making and executing a deliberate plan, researching methods, preparing materials, arranging finances, establishing escape routes. This is not impulsivity or confusion. This is calculation. Wilson then addressed the defense's mental health arguments directly, acknowledging Johnson's military service while refuting the suggestion that combat experiences had compromised his mental functioning. The defense has asked you to believe that Alan Johnson's distinguished military career somehow excuses or explains his actions, suggesting that undiagnosed PTSD transformed this decorated officer into someone who could not distinguish right from wrong, Wilson stated, her expression serious. Yet the evidence shows a man who functioned at an exceptional level professionally, who maintained complex relationships and responsibilities, who was capable of detailed planning and deliberate action. The mental health experts who regularly evaluated him throughout his military career found no evidence of PTSD or any other psychological disorder that would impair his judgment or behavior. Wilson's closing argument culminated in a powerful appeal to the jury's reason rather than emotion, asking them to follow the evidence to its logical conclusion. The defense has offered theories, speculations, and non-standard psychological concepts in an attempt to explain away the inexplicable, a father killing his 4 children. But theories and speculations are not evidence, Wilson emphasized, making eye contact with each juror in turn. The evidence in this case, the defendant's own words in his journals and text messages, his methodical preparations, his attempted flight, all point to one inescapable conclusion. Alan Johnson knew exactly what he was doing when he sedated and suffocated Otto, Jack, Liam, and Kai. He understood the nature and wrongfulness of his actions. He made a deliberate choice to end 4 innocent lives because they had become inconvenient to his desired future. That is the very definition of premeditated, first-degree murder, and that is what justice demands you find him guilty of. Defense attorney Richard Connolly's closing argument began with an acknowledgment of the emotional weight of the case, expressing appropriate solemnity about the loss of 4 young lives, while urging the jury to consider the legal standards for criminal responsibility when mental illness is involved. No one in this courtroom disputes that Alan Johnson caused the deaths of his children, Connolly stated frankly, his tone subdued. The question before you is not what happened, but why it happened, and whether Mr. Johnson's mental state at the time meets the legal threshold for the specific intent required for first-degree murder. The law recognizes that not all acts, even terrible ones, are committed with the same degree of moral culpability. The law acknowledges the reality of mental illness and its impact on human behavior and decision-making. Connolly then reviewed the testimony of the defense's expert witnesses, emphasizing Dr. Hargrove's theory about catastrophic psychological decompensation and the concept of distorted protective instincts. Mr. Johnson's military training taught him to identify threats and eliminate them efficiently to protect those under his command by making difficult, sometimes lethal decisions, Connolly argued, attempting to reframe Johnson's actions within a military context. When his psychological defenses collapsed under the weight of multiple stressors, those military instincts combined with paternal protective impulses in a tragic distortion of reality. In his severely compromised mental state, he genuinely believed he was protecting his children from what he perceived as inevitable suffering. The defense's closing argument then addressed the prosecution's evidence of planning and preparation, offering an alternative interpretation. The prosecution has made much of Mr. Johnson's research, his calendar entries, his financial arrangements, presenting them as evidence of cold calculation. But these same actions can be viewed through another lens, Connolly suggested, his voice gaining intensity. For someone whose entire identity was built around control, structure, and precision, first in the military and then as a single father, these methodical behaviors were not evidence of normal functioning, but rather his mind's attempt to maintain order as his psychological state deteriorated. The more chaotic his internal experience became, the more rigidly he clung to external order and planning. Connolly concluded with a direct appeal to the jury to consider the legal standard of reasonable doubt as it applied to Johnson's mental state. If you believe that there is reasonable doubt about whether Mr. Johnson was capable of forming the specific intent required for first-degree murder due to his mental condition at the time, the law requires you to find him not guilty of that charge and to consider lesser alternatives, Connolly emphasized, his expression grave. This is not about excusing inexcusable acts or diminishing the terrible loss of 4 innocent lives. It is about applying the law as it recognizes the complex reality of human psychology and the varying degrees of culpability that correspond to different mental states. Prosecutor Wilson's brief rebuttal focused on dismantling the defense's characterization of Johnson's mental state, returning to the concrete evidence rather than theoretical constructs. The defense has asked you to believe in a convenient psychological collapse that somehow allowed Mr. Johnson to meticulously plan his children's deaths, execute those plans with precision, arrange his escape, and attempt to flee the country, all while supposedly being unable to distinguish right from wrong or control his actions, Wilson stated, her tone reflecting controlled incredulity. The simpler and more evidence-supported explanation is that Alan Johnson made a terrible, selfish choice for which he now seeks to avoid full responsibility by claiming mental impairment. The evidence simply doesn't support that claim. As Judge Sandoval instructed the jury on the law, explaining the elements of first-degree murder, second-degree murder, and manslaughter, as well as the legal standards for diminished capacity and insanity defenses, the courtroom remained absolutely silent, the weight of the decision facing the 12 jurors palpable in the air. The judge emphasized that emotions, while natural in such a case, could not substitute for reasoned analysis of the evidence according to the legal standards provided. After nearly an hour of detailed instructions, the jury was escorted to the deliberation room at 4:45 p.m., beginning the process that would determine Alan Johnson's fate and the measure of justice for Otto, Jack, Liam, and Kai. The jury's deliberations lasted less than 3 hours, a surprisingly brief period given the complexity of the case and the seriousness of the charges. When the jury notified the court that they had reached a verdict, speculation ran high among legal observers that the quick decision likely favored the prosecution, as defense arguments about diminished capacity typically require longer deliberation. At 7:38 p.m., the jury filed back into the courtroom, their expressions solemn but determined as they took their seats. The forewoman, a retired nurse in her 60s, handed the verdict form to the bailiff, who delivered it to Judge Sandoval. The judge reviewed the document briefly. her expression revealing nothing before returning it to the bailiff for public reading. In the case of State of Arizona versus Alan Johnson, on the charge of first-degree premeditated murder of Otto Johnson, we the jury find the defendant guilty, the court clerk announced, his voice clear in the silent courtroom. He continued reading the verdicts for each child, Jack, Liam, and Kai, with the same result, guilty of first-degree premeditated murder on all counts. As the final verdict was read, a muffled sob could be heard from Catherine Smith, while Alan Johnson remained stoically upright, showing no visible reaction to the pronouncement that would likely consign him to prison for the remainder of his life. Judge Sandoval thanked the jury for their service and scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks later, remanding Johnson to custody in the interim. As the defendant was led from the courtroom by sheriff's deputies, he turned briefly toward Rachel Thomas, who had attended each day of the trial since her testimony. Their eyes met for a moment across the crowded courtroom, the father of her unborn child now convicted of murdering his 4 existing children, before Johnson was escorted through the side door that led back to the county jail. Outside the courthouse, a crowd that had gathered to await the verdict released blue balloons into the evening sky, one for each of the Johnson children whose lives had been cut short by their father's calculated decision that they were obstacles to his desired future. The sentencing hearing for Alan Johnson began at precisely 10:08 a.m. on February 16, 2024, in a courtroom even more crowded than during the trial itself, with every seat filled and a line of spectators extending down the hallway of the Maricopa County Courthouse. Judge Victoria Sandoval entered and addressed several procedural matters before turning to the main purpose of the day's proceedings. Before the court renders its sentence, there are individuals who wish to make victim impact statements, Judge Sandoval announced, her tone solemn. The court will hear these statements, followed by any statement the defendant wishes to make before pronouncing sentence. The first to approach the podium was Catherine Smith, the mother of Otto, Jack, Liam, and Kai, who had maintained remarkable composure throughout the trial, but now appeared visibly emotional as she unfolded a handwritten statement. Your Honor, I stand before you today not only as the mother of 4 murdered children, but as the voice they can no longer use for themselves, Smith began, her voice initially unsteady but gaining strength as she continued. Otto would have turned 11 last week. He wanted to be an astronomer, to discover new planets, and name one after each of his siblings. Jack was going to try out for the Olympic Development Soccer Program this spring. His coach said he had never seen such natural talent in someone so young. Liam had just mastered Beethoven's Für Elise on the piano after practicing for months in secret, wanting to surprise me during my next scheduled visit, a visit that never happened. And Kai, my only daughter, filled sketchbooks with her artwork, creating a fantasy world where, she once told me, everyone is kind and no one is ever alone. Smith paused, taking a deep breath before continuing, her gaze now directed at Johnson, who sat at the defense table in orange jail scrubs, his military posture maintained even in custody. Alan didn't just take their lives, he took their futures, their dreams, their contributions to the world. He took first dates and graduations, career choices and weddings, grandchildren I will never hold. He stole not just the children they were, but the adults they would have become, Smith stated, tears now flowing freely down her face. When I left our marriage in 2016, Alan told me that if I tried to take the children, he would make sure I never saw them again. I didn't realize then the terrible lengths to which he would go to keep that promise. There is no sentence long enough to restore what he has taken, but I ask the court to ensure that Alan Johnson spends the rest of his natural life in prison, with no possibility of ever again experiencing the freedom he so cruelly and permanently denied our children. Following Catherine Smith's statement, Samantha Johnson, Alan's sister and the children's aunt, approached the podium. Unlike Smith's raw emotion, Samantha's demeanor reflected controlled anger as she addressed the court. "Your Honor, my brother sits before you convicted of murdering his 4 children, my niece and nephews whom I loved deeply, despite his efforts to limit my relationship with them. I struggled daily with the knowledge that I recognized Alan's controlling behavior as potentially harmful, but failed to intervene effectively enough to prevent this tragedy," Samantha stated, her voice steady, despite the pain evident in her expression. Otto, Jack, Liam, and Kai were extraordinary children who somehow maintained their individual sparks despite Alan's attempts to mold them into perfect extensions of himself. They deserve to be celebrated for their uniqueness, not punished for it. They deserve to be loved unconditionally, not valued only for their achievements, and above all, they deserve to live, to grow, to become whoever they might have chosen to be. Samantha then addressed her brother directly, turning to face him at the defense table. "Alan, I have spent months trying to understand how the brother I grew up with could commit such an unimaginable act. I've searched our childhood, our family history, your military experiences, looking for some explanation that would make sense of the senseless. But there is no explanation that suffices, no trauma or stress or mental illness that justifies what you did. You made a choice, a series of choices, that revealed your fundamental belief that your children were possessions rather than people, means to your ends rather than ends in themselves. Whatever sentence the court imposes cannot approach justice for Otto, Jack, Liam, and Kai, but I pray it ensures that you never again have the opportunity to control, manipulate, or harm another human being." The courtroom fell completely silent as Rachel Thomas, now in the 3rd trimester of her pregnancy, slowly made her way to the podium. Her presence at the sentencing hearing had been uncertain until the last moment, and murmurs rippled through the gallery before Judge Sandoval called for order. "Your Honor, I come before you today, carrying the only surviving child of Alan Johnson, a child who will be born into a legacy of tragedy, not of their own making," Thomas began, her hand resting protectively over her abdomen. "I have struggled every day since September 18th with the knowledge that my ultimatum, however innocently intended, became part of the chain of events that led to the deaths of 4 innocent children. That is a burden I will carry for the rest of my life, alongside the responsibility of someday explaining to my child why their father is in prison and why they have siblings they will never meet." Thomas then addressed Johnson directly, turning slightly toward the defense table, though not making eye contact with the defendant. "Alan, when I told you to fix your situation by September 18th, I meant for you to be honest with me, with your children, with yourself. I wanted integration, not elimination, truth, not tragedy. Never in my darkest imaginings did I think you would interpret my words as permission or provocation to do what you did. I have replayed our conversations countless times, wondering if there were signs I missed or words I could have chosen differently that might have prevented this outcome. But ultimately, the choice was yours alone. The calculations, the plans, the actions that took 4 innocent lives." Thomas's voice broke slightly as she continued, "Our child will be born in approximately 2 months. I have decided that they will know about their siblings, about Otto's love of astronomy, Jack's athletic gifts, Liam's musical talent, and Kai's artistic spirit. They will know that part of their family history includes profound tragedy, but that tragedy does not define them or determine their future. What they will never know, if I can protect them from it, is the coldness with which their father calculated that some lives were worth more than others, that some children were obstacles while others were opportunities. No child should have to bear the weight of such knowledge about a parent." After the victim impact statements concluded, Judge Sandoval asked if the defendant wished to make a statement before sentencing. Alan Johnson rose slowly, maintaining the precise posture ingrained by decades of military service, and addressed the court in a clear, controlled voice that showed no hint of emotion or remorse. Your Honor, I have been advised by counsel to express remorse and seek mercy from this court. I cannot in good conscience do either, Johnson stated, his tone as measured as if delivering a military briefing. I maintain that my actions, while judged criminal by this court and jury, were taken with the sincere belief that I was protecting my children from what I perceived as a greater harm. The prosecution has characterized my decisions as selfish and calculating. I would describe them as necessary and merciful, given the circumstances as I understood them at the time. Johnson continued, addressing the gallery rather than the judge. I recognize that my perspective is not shared by this court or by society at large. I accept that there are consequences for actions that violate social and legal norms, regardless of the intent behind those actions. I do not seek mercy or special consideration. I ask only that this court acknowledge that my military service to this country was honorable, and that prior to September 18, 2023, I fulfilled my duties as a father according to my understanding of what would best serve my children's development and future prospects. Johnson's statement, notable for its complete lack of emotional content or explicit acknowledgement of the gravity of his crimes, concluded with a formal "Thank you, Your Honor," before he returned to his seat, leaving a palpable sense of disbelief in the courtroom at his continued rationalization of the murders. Judge Sandoval sat in silence for several moments after Johnson's statement, reviewing her notes before addressing the defendant directly. Mr. Johnson, the jury in this case has found you guilty of 4 counts of first-degree premeditated murder in the deaths of your children, Otto, Jack, Liam, and Kai Johnson. I have considered the evidence presented at trial, the jury's verdict, the victim impact statements heard today, your own statement, and all relevant factors under Arizona law for sentencing in capital cases, Judge Sandoval began, her expression grave. The prosecution has not sought the death penalty in this case, leaving life imprisonment as the maximum sentence available. Before pronouncing that sentence, I wish to address several aspects of this case that I find particularly disturbing. Judge Sandoval leaned forward slightly, her gaze fixed on Johnson. Throughout this trial, and again in your statement today, you have attempted to frame the murders of your children as acts of protection or mercy. The evidence, however, tells a different story, one of a man who viewed his children as possessions or obstacles rather than as individuals with inherent value and rights. Your journals, your digital records, and your actions reveal not a father protecting his children from harm, but a man eliminating what he had come to see as impediments to his desired future. This calculated redefinition of murder as mercy represents a moral distortion that the court finds particularly reprehensible. The judge continued, her voice gaining intensity. The court also notes the extraordinary breach of trust these crimes represent. Children naturally and necessarily trust their parents for protection, nurturing, and guidance. You exploited that trust in the most fundamental way possible, using your position as their father, the person they look to for safety, to end their lives. This violation of the sacred bond between parent and child strikes at the very foundation of family and society, representing not just murder, but the perversion of the parental role into an instrument of death rather than life. Judge Sandoval then addressed Johnson's reference to his military service. The court acknowledges your military service to this country, Mr. Johnson. However, rather than mitigating your crimes, I find that your military background aggravates them in several respects. You utilize skills and knowledge gained through your military training, discipline, planning, tactical thinking, to commit and attempt to escape accountability for these murders. Moreover, you have repeatedly invoked military concepts of necessary action and collateral damage to rationalize the killing of your own children, suggesting that you view the taking of human life, through a lens so detached from normal human empathy and moral reasoning that it raises serious concerns about your capacity for rehabilitation. The courtroom remained absolutely silent as Judge Sandoval prepared to pronounce sentence, the weight of the moment palpable in the air. Alan Johnson, having been found guilty of 4 counts of first-degree premeditated murder, and the court having found multiple aggravating factors and no significant mitigating factors, it is the judgment and sentence of this court that you be committed to the Arizona Department of Corrections for consecutive terms of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for each count, for a total of 4 consecutive life sentences. Judge Sandoval paused before adding, "For the record, that constitutes a 290-year sentence, ensuring that you will spend the remainder of your natural life incarcerated and will never have the opportunity to pose a danger to society again." Judge Sandoval concluded the proceedings with a final statement directed not at Johnson, but at the victims and those who mourned them. No sentence this court could impose can restore the lives of Otto, Jack, Liam, and Kai Johnson, or adequately measure the loss their deaths represent, not just to their family and community, but to a world that will never know what contributions they might have made, what joy they might have brought, what lives they might have touched. The court can only ensure that justice, as our legal system defines and limits it, is served through the defendant's permanent removal from society and the clear message that no rationalization, no matter how elaborately constructed, can justify or excuse the taking of innocent lives. As Alan Johnson was led from the courtroom by sheriff's deputies, his military bearing still evident in his straight back and measured steps, the gallery remained seated in somber silence, the magnitude of the tragedy and the justice dispensed settling over the assembled spectators. Outside the courthouse, a community that had followed the case with horror and heartbreak gathered for a memorial vigil, releasing blue balloons and lighting candles in memory of the 4 Johnson children. Catherine Smith, supported by family members, briefly addressed the assembled crowd, announcing the establishment of a foundation in her children's names that would support research and intervention programs focused on controlling and abusive family dynamics, turning unimaginable loss into a mission to protect other children from similar fates. In the months and years that followed, the case of Arizona versus Johnson would be studied in law schools and psychology programs as an example of how rigid control needs compartmentalized thinking and distorted moral reasoning can culminate in familicide when a parent comes to view their children as extensions of themselves rather than as autonomous individuals. Rachel Thomas gave birth to a healthy daughter in April 2024, choosing to name her Hope, in reflection of her determination that the child's future would not be defined by her father's crimes. The 4 consecutive life sentences imposed on Alan Johnson, colloquially referred to as his 290-year sentence, became symbolic of the severity with which the justice system viewed his crimes and the community's determination that the lives of Otto, Jack, Liam, and Kai Johnson would be remembered not just for how they ended, but for the bright potential that had been so callously extinguished by the one person who should have protected them above all others.